In the darkest chapter of human history, amid the systematic destruction of European jewelry, certain names emerge from the shadows, not as heroes, but as embodiments of humanity's capacity for cruelty. Among the perpetrators of the Holocaust, one man's actions at the Treblinka extermination facility would earn him a nickname that echoed through survivor testimony for decades: Ivan the Terrible. This is the story of Ivan Marchenko, a Ukrainian man who transformed from a simple miner into one of the most brutal guards in the Nazi machinery of death. His crimes, committed in the service of Operation Reinhard, represent not only individual evil, but also the systematic perversion of ordinary people into instruments of genocide. To understand how Ivan Marchenko became Ivan the Terrible, we must first understand the catastrophic events that shaped Eastern Europe in the early 1940s, a continent consumed by war, where millions of lives would be extinguished in pursuit of an ideology built on hatred and racial superiority. The autumn of 1939 marked a turning point in world history. On September 1st, German forces crossed into Poland, unleashing a new form of warfare that the world would come to know as Blitzkrieg, lightning war. Tanks, aircraft, and mechanized infantry moved with unprecedented speed, overwhelming Polish defenses and shattering the relative peace that had held since the Great War ended 2 decades earlier. Britain and France, bound by treaties to defend Polish sovereignty, declared war on Germany 2 days later. The Second World War had begun. But Poland's agony was only beginning. The nation found itself caught between 2 totalitarian powers when, on September 17th, the Soviet Union invaded from the east. This second invasion came as a devastating shock, the result of a secret protocol attached to the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, signed just weeks earlier. Polish forces fought with extraordinary courage, but they were outmatched and outnumbered on 2 fronts. The government evacuated Warsaw as German artillery shells rained down on the capital. After weeks of bombardment and siege, Warsaw surrendered on September 28th. The following day, Germany and the Soviet Union formally partitioned Poland between them, erasing the nation from the map. The last organized Polish resistance collapsed on October 6, 1939. For Poland's 3.5 million Jews, the largest Jewish community in Europe, this occupation marked the beginning of an unprecedented nightmare. The German occupation zone, designated as the General Government, would become the primary killing ground of the Holocaust. The uneasy alliance between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union lasted less than 2 years. On June 22, 1941, Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, sending more than 3 million German soldiers crashing across the Soviet frontier. It was the largest military invasion in human history, stretching from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south. Another 650,000 troops from Germany's allies, Romania, Hungary, Italy, and others, joined the assault. The initial German advance was devastating. Soviet defenses crumbled under the combined assault of tanks, artillery, and aircraft. Entire Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of Red Army soldiers were captured in the opening weeks. The speed and scale of the disaster caught Soviet leadership unprepared, despite numerous intelligence warnings. By the end of 1941, German forces had penetrated deep into Soviet territory, laying siege to Leningrad in the north and reaching the outskirts of Moscow. The human cost was staggering. The Wehrmacht, captured approximately 5.7 million Soviet soldiers over the course of the war. Of these, roughly 3.3 million, 57%, would perish in German captivity. They died from starvation, exposure, disease, forced labor, and deliberate execution. After the Jews, Soviet prisoners of war constituted the second largest victim group of Nazi racial ideology. Among those captured in the catastrophic summer of 1941 was a Ukrainian miner named Ivan Marchenko. Ivan Marchenko was born on March 2, 1911, in the village of Serhiyovka in Ukraine, then part of the Russian Empire. His early life followed the pattern common to millions in rural Ukraine. He grew up in a region marked by agricultural tradition, but also scarred by the devastating famines of the early Soviet period. As an adult, Marchenko found work as a miner, supporting his wife and 3 children through hard physical labor in the coal-rich regions of Ukraine. When Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union, Marchenko, like millions of Soviet men, was mobilized. He entered the Red Army Infantry on May 27, 1941, less than a month before Operation Barbarossa began. His military service was tragically brief. On July 10, 1941, just 18 days after the German invasion commenced, Marchenko was captured by German forces. He was transported to prisoner of war camp A in Khelm in German-occupied Poland. The conditions in these camps were deliberately lethal. Nazi racial ideology viewed Slavic peoples, particularly Soviet citizens, as racially inferior. POW camps received minimal food rations, inadequate shelter, and no medical care. Prisoners died by the thousands from starvation and disease. The camps themselves were often nothing more than open fields surrounded by barbed wire, where men huddled together against the elements, waiting for death. But in October 1941, Ivan Marchenko's fate took a different turn. He was selected for transfer to a special facility, the Trawniki training camp. In the fall of 1941, Nazi leadership made the decision to move from selective killings and ghettoization to total annihilation. Under the code name Operation Reinhard, named after Reinhard Heydrich, the architect of the final solution, who was assassinated in Prague in 1942, the Germans constructed 3 specialized extermination facilities in occupied Poland: Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. These were not concentration camps in the traditional sense. They were not designed for forced labor or long-term imprisonment. They were killing factories, engineered with a single purpose: to transform living human beings into corpses as quickly and efficiently as possible. Their target was the approximately 2 million Jews living in the general government region. The 3 facilities operated in relative secrecy, located in sparsely populated areas near railway lines. Their existence was known only to those directly involved in operations. No records were kept of individual victims. The goal was not just to eliminate people, but to erase all evidence of their existence. The scale of the killing was unprecedented. Operation Reinhard would ultimately claim approximately 1.5 million lives, making it the deadliest phase of the Holocaust. The victims included entire Jewish communities, men, women, children, and infants, transported from ghettos across Poland. The Trawniki Men provided the manpower essential to these operations. They guarded the facilities, controlled the arrivals, forced victims through the process, and handled the aftermath. Their role was indispensable to the German plan. Construction of Treblinka extermination facility began in the summer of 1942. Located in a remote forested area northeast of Warsaw, it was positioned strategically near a railway junction. The camp was designed with lessons learned from the earlier operations at Belzec and Sobibor. Every aspect of its layout served the purpose of deception and efficiency. The facility was relatively small, covering only 15 hectares, but its design was methodical. When transport trains arrived, carrying 50 to 60 cattle cars packed with human beings, they first stopped at Marchenko railway station. There, 20 cars at a time were detached and brought into the camp proper. The first area victims encountered was carefully designed to deceive. A fake railway station was constructed, complete with a painted clock frozen at a specific time, destination signs listing fictional locations, and even a ticket window. The Germans understood that panic would create chaos and slow the process. Deception kept victims calm and compliant. SS personnel and Trawniki guards announced that this was merely a transit camp. Deportees were told they would be traveling further east for resettlement and labor. They were instructed to surrender all valuables for safekeeping. These items, watches, jewelry, currency, family photographs, were collected, sorted in massive warehouses, and shipped back to Germany. From the reception area, victims were directed to large barracks where they were ordered to undress. Men were separated from women and children. Signs indicated they were to proceed to shower facilities for disinfection before receiving work assignments. Every detail reinforced the deception. What survivors would later call the tube was a narrow fenced path that led from the undressing barracks to the killing facilities. The path was camouflaged with branches woven through the fencing to prevent those inside from seeing what lay beyond. Guards lined the route, using clubs and whips to force victims to run naked along this final corridor. The killing facilities themselves were disguised as shower rooms. Heavy doors could be sealed from the outside. Instead of water pipes, however, the building contained something else entirely. A large diesel engine, captured from a Soviet tank, that pumped carbon monoxide exhaust directly into the sealed chambers. The process, from arrival to completion, took approximately 3 hours initially. As the operations continued and the German personnel refined their methods, this was reduced to as little as 30 minutes. The Nazi obsession with efficiency extended even to industrialized murder.
Among the Trawniki guards at Treblinka, certain men were designated as motorists, not because they drove vehicles, but because they operated the engines that produced the lethal gas. This was considered a specialized position, requiring both technical knowledge and a willingness to perform the actual act of mass execution. Ivan Marchenko was assigned this role. In May 1942, he arrived at Treblinka and began his work as a motorist. Survivor testimony from those who worked in the Sonderkommando units, Jewish prisoners forced to process bodies and maintain the facilities, would later provide detailed accounts of Marchenko's actions and character. The motorists controlled the diesel engines that pumped carbon monoxide into the sealed chambers. They determined when to start the engines, how long to run them, and when the process was complete. The work required them to be present throughout, to monitor the machinery, to ensure efficient operation. But Ivan Marchenko went far beyond the technical requirements of his position. Survivors remembered him for his exceptional cruelty, for acts that seemed to go beyond even the horrific norms of Treblinka. His violence appeared to stem not from orders, but from some personal pathology, some inner darkness that the camp environment allowed to flourish without restraint.
Marchenko earned his nickname, Ivan Grozny, Polish for Ivan the Terrible, through actions that shocked even other guards and left indelible marks on survivor memory. While forcing victims into the killing facilities, he wielded a whip and a metal pipe, striking people brutally, shouting at them to move faster, mocking them with remarks about the water getting cold or others needing to use the showers. During the operation of the engines, while carbon monoxide filled the chambers and people inside suffocated, Marchenko was said to peer through a small window, observing the process with disturbing satisfaction. His role required his presence, but witnesses described his demeanor as something beyond mere duty, an unsettling engagement with human suffering. Survivors recalled his proficiency with violence. With a single blow of a metal pipe, he could end a life. He often carried a sword, which he used to intimidate and injure those being driven to their deaths. Many testified that he seemed to target women in particular, inflicting cruelty that served no purpose within the already horrific process. Testimonies also described a pattern of abuse that went beyond ordinary brutality. He inflicted degrading and sadistic treatment on prisoners, with survivors remembering his fascination with mutilation and acts of humiliation that left lasting psychological scars. Marchenko even kept a trained dog, which he reportedly used as a tool of terror. Witnesses stated that the animal was directed to attack on command, reinforcing the climate of fear within the camp. Accounts after the war described further disturbing behavior. Survivors recalled how he singled out the most vulnerable, pregnant women, children, and the very young for particularly harsh treatment. In one testimony, a girl of perhaps 12 years old emerged alive from the chambers, crying for her mother. Marchenko forced others into impossible choices under threat of death, and when they refused, both they and the child were executed. Another survivor described him tearing an infant from its mother and killing the child in front of her, an act of cruelty so extreme that it defied any rationale, serving no purpose beyond the expression of sheer brutality.
While individual acts of cruelty were documented and remembered, they occurred within a larger systematic operation. Treblinka was not the work of individual sadists, but a coordinated effort of the Nazi state to eliminate entire populations. Deportations to Treblinka came primarily from the Warsaw Ghetto, the largest Jewish ghetto in occupied Europe, where more than 400,000 people were confined in a space of approximately 3.4 square kilometers. Beginning in July 1942, the Germans initiated what they termed resettlement operations. Daily, thousands of Jews were rounded up and forced onto trains bound for Treblinka. The deportees were told they were being relocated to labor camps in the east. In reality, almost all were dead within hours of arrival. Between July and September 1942 alone, approximately 265,000 Jews from Warsaw were transported to Treblinka and immediately eliminated. Deportations continued throughout 1942 and into 1943 from ghettos throughout the general government. The Radom district, Lublin, smaller towns and villages, entire Jewish communities were systematically emptied. The trains arrived with devastating regularity. Josef Czarny, a Holocaust survivor who lost his parents in the Warsaw Ghetto, later provided testimony about his experience. At age 16, he was transported to Treblinka, where he spent 10 months as a forced laborer. He described the transport trains as scenes of unimaginable horror. People crushed together so tightly they could not move, the air thick and stifling, individuals losing their sanity from the conditions. He remembered people driven to such desperation they consumed their own waste. He heard his sisters calling for their father, but could not reach them through the press of bodies. While Josef survived, his 3 sisters were among the countless victims processed immediately upon arrival. As operations at Treblinka continued through 1942 and into 1943, Jewish prisoners forced to work in the camp became increasingly aware that their survival was temporary. They understood that once the deportation ceased, they themselves would be eliminated to erase all witnesses. In early 1943, prisoner leaders began quietly organizing resistance. The logistics were extraordinarily difficult. The prisoners were constantly watched, malnourished, traumatized, and physically exhausted. But they began secretly communicating, identifying others willing to risk everything for a chance at survival and vengeance. The resistance was led by several prisoners, including those assigned to work details that gave them slightly more freedom of movement. They began stealing small items that could serve as weapons, knives from the sorting areas, tools from workshops. They observed the routines of guards, identifying moments of vulnerability. The plan was ambitious: seize weapons from the camp armory, overwhelm the guards, and enable mass escape. They understood most would die in the attempt, but any who survived could bear witness to what had occurred. On August 2, 1943, the uprising began. Prisoners managed to access the armory and distribute weapons, including firearms and grenades. However, they were discovered before they could fully implement their plan. When the alarm was raised, hundreds of prisoners made a desperate rush toward the main gate. German SS personnel and Trawniki guards responded with machine gun fire. Prisoners fell by the dozens. But in the chaos, more than 300 managed to breach the perimeter and escape into the surrounding forest. For those who made it past the wire, a new ordeal began. They had to evade German patrols, navigate unfamiliar territory, and somehow survive in a hostile landscape. German authorities launched immediate pursuit. Military units, police formations, and local collaborators scoured the area. Over the following weeks, approximately 200 of the escapees were hunted down and killed, but roughly 100 managed to evade capture, some joining partisan units, others finding refuge with sympathetic Poles. These survivors would become crucial witnesses to history.
Following the uprising, German authorities decided to accelerate Treblinka's closure. Most of the remaining Jewish prisoners were immediately eliminated. A small number were kept alive temporarily to assist in dismantling the facility, a final, bitter task before their own execution. The Germans were meticulous in attempting to erase evidence. The buildings were demolished, the machinery removed, the mass burial pits excavated, and bodies burned. The earth was plowed and planted with lupine flowers to suggest agricultural use. An ethnic German farmer was installed on the property with instructions to maintain the fiction that nothing extraordinary had occurred there. By fall 1943, Treblinka ceased operations. In approximately 15 months of operation, the facility had served as the site of approximately 925,000 Jewish deaths, along with unknown numbers of Poles, Roma people, and Soviet prisoners of war. It was one of history's most concentrated episodes of mass murder. After the closure of Treblinka, Ivan Marchenko was transferred back to Trawniki camp in August 1943. From there, his movements become more difficult to trace, but available evidence suggests he was reassigned to the Italian theater. He reportedly spent time in Trieste, a contested port city in northeastern Italy, where Trawniki men were employed in various guard duties. His responsibilities included guarding German warehouses at the port, providing security at the local prison, and participating in roundup operations to capture Italian civilians for forced labor transportation to Germany. The last confirmed sighting of Ivan Marchenko occurred in March 1945, as Allied forces closed in on Axis positions throughout Italy.
He was reportedly seen leaving a brothel in the Adriatic city of Fiume as German forces collapsed and Yugoslav partisan units advanced. Marchenko apparently joined with partisan forces, attempting to blend in and escape prosecution. After March 1945, Ivan Marchenko vanished from the historical record. Despite efforts by war crimes investigators in the post-war period, he was never located, never arrested, never brought to trial. His ultimate fate remains unknown. He may have perished in the final chaos of the war, or he may have successfully constructed a new identity and lived out his life in obscurity.
For decades following the war, survivor testimony about Ivan the Terrible remained part of the historical record, but the actual identity of the perpetrator was uncertain. Then, in the 1970s, attention focused on John Demjanjuk, a Ukrainian-born auto worker living a quiet retirement in suburban Cleveland, Ohio. Demjanjuk had immigrated to the United States after the war, claiming to have been a Soviet prisoner of war who was liberated by American forces. But in the late 70s, evidence emerged suggesting he had served as a guard at Nazi facilities. An identification card from Trawniki training camp bearing his photograph was discovered in Soviet archives. Holocaust survivors were shown photographs, and several identified Demjanjuk as Ivan the Terrible. The testimony was powerful and emotional. Survivors pointed to specific features, recalled his face from decades earlier, described his actions in detail. Based on this evidence, Demjanjuk was stripped of his American citizenship, extradited to Israel, and tried in Jerusalem in 1988. The trial was emotionally charged, with survivors providing testimony about the horrors they had witnessed at Treblinka. Demjanjuk was convicted and sentenced to death. However, after the fall of the Soviet Union, previously closed archives became accessible to Western researchers. Among the documents were SS personnel files from Trawniki training camp. These files included identification cards, deployment records, and other documentation. Researchers discovered evidence that another man, Ivan Marchenko, had been assigned to Treblinka as a motorist during the relevant period. Physical descriptions matched survivor testimony more closely. Additional witnesses confirmed that Marchenko was the guard known as Ivan the Terrible. In 1993, the Israeli Supreme Court overturned Demjanjuk's conviction due to reasonable doubt about his identity as Ivan the Terrible. The court acknowledged that Demjanjuk had served as a guard at other Nazi facilities, but could not be certain he was the specific perpetrator at Treblinka. He was released and returned to the United States, though he was later convicted in Germany for his role at Sobibor extermination camp. The Demjanjuk case highlighted the challenges of Holocaust justice decades after the crimes occurred, the difficulty of identification, the fallibility of memory, the importance of documentary evidence. It also underscored a bitter reality. Many perpetrators escaped justice entirely. The story of Ivan Marchenko forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about human nature and the conditions that enable ordinary people to commit extraordinary evil. Marchenko was not born a monster. He was a miner, a husband, a father. But within the framework of totalitarian ideology, genocidal state policy, and the deliberate brutalization cultivated at Trawniki, he became one of history's most sadistic perpetrators. His crimes were not isolated acts of individual madness, but occurred within a systematic program of mass murder planned and executed by the Nazi state. Operation Reinhard represented bureaucratic genocide, mass killing organized with industrial efficiency, implemented by a combination of true believers, careerists, and those simply following orders. The Trawniki Men occupy an uncomfortable position in Holocaust historiography. They were themselves victims of Nazi aggression, captured soldiers who faced death in POW camps.
Yet they chose, or were coerced into, becoming perpetrators. Their collaboration made the Holocaust possible on the scale it achieved. Without them, the Germans lacked the manpower to operate the killing centers. Understanding perpetrators like Marchenko does not mean excusing their actions. Rather, it requires us to recognize that genocidal systems depend on recruiting ordinary individuals and transforming them into instruments of state murder. The Nazis understood this, which is why they created training programs like Trawniki, why they offered material incentives for collaboration, why they provided ideological justification for atrocity. The testimony of survivors, men and women like Joseph Charny, Yehiel Reichman, and Pinchas Epstein, ensures that Ivan Marchenko's crimes are not forgotten. Though he escaped earthly justice, his actions are recorded in historical memory. The survivors who endured Treblinka carried the weight of witness, ensuring that those who perished would not be erased from history as the Nazis intended. Today, Treblinka is a memorial site. The fields where the facility once stood are marked with thousands of stones, representing the Jewish communities destroyed in Operation Reinhard. A monument stands where the killing facilities once operated. Visitors walk paths that roughly follow the route victims took from the railway platform to their deaths. The site serves as a reminder of the consequences when hatred becomes state policy, when dehumanization becomes systematic, when ordinary people fail to resist or actively participate in evil. It reminds us that the Holocaust was not an inevitable historical event, but resulted from specific choices made by individuals and institutions. The story of Ivan Marchenko and Treblinka connects to the broader narrative of World War II, a conflict that claimed more than 60 million lives, that saw entire nations devastated, that fundamentally altered the global order. The Holocaust was both part of this larger catastrophe and something distinct, a deliberate attempt to annihilate entire peoples based on ideology and racial theory. In the decades since, the world has adopted international laws intended to prevent such atrocities, established tribunals to prosecute genocide and crimes against humanity, and created institutions dedicated to Holocaust remembrance and education. These efforts reflect a collective determination that such events must never recur. Yet the story also serves as a warning. Genocides have occurred since 1945, in Cambodia, in Rwanda, in Bosnia, in Darfur. The conditions that enable mass atrocity, dehumanizing propaganda, authoritarian governance, societal division, economic instability, remain present in various forms around the world. The victims of Treblinka deserve to live full lives, to raise their children, to pursue their dreams, to contribute to their communities. Instead, they were systematically destroyed by a state that viewed their existence as intolerable. We honor their memory not through abstract commemorations alone, but through commitment to defending human dignity, opposing hatred, and refusing indifference in the face of injustice. Ivan Marchenko may have escaped legal accountability, but history has rendered its judgment. His name endures not as a symbol of strength, despite his nickname, but as a cautionary reminder of how far human beings can fall when moral constraints are removed and cruelty is not only permitted but encouraged by the state. The approximately 925,000 people murdered at Treblinka were individuals, each with a name, a family, a story. They spoke Yiddish and Polish, Hebrew and German. They celebrated holidays, fell in love,
argued politics, worried about the future, hoped for peace. The final solution sought to reduce them to numbers, to eliminate them without trace, to erase Jewish civilization from Europe. The survivors who lived to testify, the documents that preserve their names, the memorials that mark their absence, all serve as defiance against that intention. In the end, the most powerful response to Ivan Marchenko and those like him is memory, not just of perpetrators, but of victims. We remember not to cultivate hatred, but to reinforce commitment to the principle that every human life possesses inherent dignity and worth, that civilization depends on moral limits, and that justice, though sometimes delayed, remains an essential aspiration. The story of Treblinka, of Operation Reinhard, of Ivan Marchenko is a story we must continue telling. Not because it is easy or comfortable, but because forgetting would be the final victory for those who sought to destroy. In bearing witness, in educating new generations, in maintaining vigilance against the recurrence of such evil, we ensure that the victims are not forgotten and that the lessons of history continue to resonate.